everyone, to the DePIN podcast. I'm your host, Tom Trowbridge. I'm excited to have Robert Koschig with me from 1KX, who is going to dig into everything related to token economics. And we got to understand token economics well if you want to understand DePIN. DePIN doesn't work without successful token economics. But Robert, before we get into that, first question I ask people is help us define DePIN, because I've got lots of people have come up with slightly different definitions. I want to make sure everyone is has their own chance to put their stamp on this this pretty new term. So how would you characterize DePIN?
Yeah, pretty broad. My mental model is always like it's anything where you need physical infrastructure, and that could be server, could be sensor, for use cases that is not operating a blockchain. This is where I would draw the line.
Fine. So would you agree then it would be, crowdsourced physical infrastructure tied together by a common software layer, often with the crypto economics to provide incentives and trust?
Yeah, that's one way.
Something like that. Yeah. Great. So just making that out there, you'd be surprised how many other groups out there, different people are still kind of piecing together what it is. So let's dig in quickly to token economics. I know you've done a lot of research on it. Tell us kind of some of the research you've done, what you're working on, what you're finding in the sort of token economic space, which is a huge topic, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, right, my day-to-day work at 1KX is helping our portfolio companies designing token models. But part of my research is focused on DePIN specifically because, it's very, very interesting and also complex, which makes it even more interesting. I mean, overall, right, DePIN, you have this flywheel of, supply, allows usage, allows better UX, drives the demand needs more supply, and then the wheel goes. And it's all about how do you design incentives, mechanisms to, kind of like spur the flywheel, because typically, you need already quite a decent amount of supply to get the wheel going. And this is what's about to also set it up in motion that is also sustainable, right? I guess that's the caveat I would add, because just getting a flywheel in motion is not too hard, but it's like burning up a fire. Getting a fire burning up is not too hard, but everybody who has a chamber or whatever, that igniting it is easy, but then it needs to last as well.
Fair enough. And so, with regard to that, what you're talking about, and I think we all are, is to have sustainable DePIN ecosystems. You have to have this flywheel work for, basically in perpetuity. And so I guess your point is to phrase it slightly differently, is you may be able to get people excited about a project and some token economics in the beginning, but for this to really work, it has to transition from initial excitement to actual use and actual utility, and has to provide value in a way that is captured by the token in order to keep trust and the economic kind of underpinnings the network functioning, right?
Yes. And I would even add to that, because that's, since you ask about my research, right? We started originally to say, okay, how do DePINs reward their supply side typically, because this is typically where it starts, and how is this evolving into the network economics. And one aspect that came then as a second part is like, okay, once we understood, this is the token emissions and how networks do that in practice and how things worked out, you see, okay, you ask yourself, okay, especially when you consider, I mean, the supply side, this is setting up a sensor, setting up a server, operating compute, whatever. This typically has dollar-based costs, right? It's similar to when you think about DeFi and the other use cases. It's dollar-based cost because this is what you pay for your compute, power, bandwidth, whatever. And yet the rewards typically is in the token. And this already is obviously not the same and comes with discrepancies. So the second research piece was about understanding, okay, how much does it actually cost to run your DePIN network? Because that actually should help you inform your reward mechanisms, like how much should you reward and when. Because again, if you have something that costs $1,000 to operate and you pay the people $10,000 worth of your token, you will find people who will do that. Otherwise around, if you just pay them 500, you probably won't. But how can you ensure, because these DePINs, these network effects and these flywheels, they work over multiple years. So how can you balance these things and set up mechanisms in place, that you don't have somebody manually tweaking these things every day, that they last. And this is then, once, even if you figured out the rewards and the costs, there's still a third piece that you mentioned, right? On like, okay, but obviously on the long run, you want to have income and demand that actually pays for the supply so that token rewards can actually diminish. And yeah, these three large pieces is where I'm currently diving quite deep.
Well, listen, that want to dig into all of that, because I think that's at the core of everything here. And so, first of all, I also highlight a problem. Like there's two problems we're trying to solve for. One is, if you're being paid in a token and the token goes down in value because of the project or the market, you may not be able to cover your cost, as you said, and that will reduce the supply of whatever that is on the network. It may impair the network's ability to function, right? And that would then reduce people's interest in using the network, and the whole thing has a negative consequence, right? So totally grasp that. But the other problem, and this was highlighted to me by some miners in a particular project, is if the token is too valuable, you may attract a set of providers who have no interest in doing anything other than getting that token and not making the transition to the actual work, whatever that network is, down the road, because it's too easy to just collect this high value token, pay the small cost that they have, and you then attract a universe that isn't interested in actually doing the work of whatever that protocol, that DePIN protocol, is trying to do. So you're not just protecting on the downside of not being able to cover your costs. If you have excessive rewards, you may create other incentives and problems as well.
Yeah, exactly, right. It works in both directions, and that's the why I'm very much leaning towards, when you design incentives, first of all, you want to separate the roles, like what are people contributing to the network and what's the corresponding incentives. Because, for example, if you provide storage, compute power, whatever, it's one role, right? There are other roles as well, even if you separate like just providing the infrastructure towards operating the infrastructure. For me, there's also two different roles. Again, if you later on put them together, as a separate story. But the point of these excesses is, that happened, right? And then this comes back to the first piece on the reward structure. There's obviously never like a good or wrong token mechanism, how you reward emissions. They all have a point. It's more like what you're trying to achieve. But you just need to be aware, for example, if you go for this like Bitcoin approach to say, hey, before we launch the token, we just set the schedule how we emit these tokens in perpetuity. It's known, it will halve, and this is how it goes. Then this is how you emit the token. Then you are exposed to market fluctuation and speculations. And then we saw 2021, right? A lot of the token prices just moved a lot. Are we Filecoin? And that obviously all of a sudden made the margins for operators so immensely intense, right? It's insane if you look at the data of Filecoin, right? There was a month where Filecoin miners got dollars unlocked to have a vesting, but unlocked technically, if you convert that to dollars, it was more than $1 billion. And yes, running a storage provider for Filecoin is costly, and back then it was even more costlier, but it probably wasn't even half a
Definitely
billion.
Not.
And it also shows you like this kind of like how the complexity of the whole thing, because now that we had the bear market, you talk to a lot of protocols, and all of a sudden they see the need to be more cost efficient. They discuss in the communities, and they figure out, if you do it this and this way, we can save costs, right? So this excess is also make it very inefficient to run the network. And you as a protocol, you will want to find ways to say, well, yes, currently we have the money to basically incentivize this cost of operations, but are there ways to basically get it down? And it's insane. I mean, Filecoin, they introduced a couple of things that got the cost down by 90% to, for sealing, for example. But there's other, Pocket also like great innovations. And if you talk to them, like also over 90% cost reductions. Ideally, it doesn't need a bear market for you as a protocol to tackle these things. I guess that's the whole point of considering your reward mechanism together with the cost of operating your network. And that's why the second piece on cost came in to basically help understand, what is actually the cost to run a DePIN.
And how do you think about protocols that reset the rewards, right? I believe Filecoin, the one you mentioned, those rewards are, I think, set on a schedule that decline, if I'm correct. But you look at something like Arweave, I believe that those rewards actually recalibrate based on a target amount of storage available in the network. I think with the view that if storage grows by a certain amount or below a certain amount, more Arweave is needed. If it grows by too much, less Arweave is needed. So while it's not an actual link to fiat necessarily, there is sort of supply-demand response that impacts the token amount paid for storage to kind of try to have a relationship with pricing.
Yeah. I mean, it is actually also Filecoin, I think what you're referring to, because they have two mechanisms, and that's a little bit confusing. They have the called simple-based minting, which is the Bitcoin approach with, decades. But then they have these target baseline that they call, where this exponential storage target, where they say, okay, if we have supply above that, the incentive is basically capped at that level. Right, and there's also something they hit, right, and there's a little bit to adjust for it. But again, this is also, I mean, it limits the rewards on the token basis, which is also good enough incentive, right? This is a good mechanism, but still doesn't capture the whole cost component for your storage provider. But maybe to be fair, also since we're talking on Filecoin, I think there it's also a little bit tricky because exactly what I mentioned earlier, knowing the roles and what you reward them for. Right? It sounds so simple to say, well, Filecoin, storage provider, you just need to provide like these storage, and then all the compute on top. It's costly, but operating that, like, why would you earn so many millions? They, in the same time, also are the ones that operate basically what we call accounting layer, kind of like the blockchain, right? So you have like one entity having several roles, and I think that's a little bit why it's also tough to calibrate kind of like the incentive models. Plus, I mean, it's also early, so.
Well, I know I agree, understood on the baseline targets there. I think the Arweave reward though adjusts every several blocks based on storage. But we don't need to get into the super details. But it's not. But it's a more fluid adjustment, I believe. But and the other but different, taking the conversation slightly differently. We're talking with Filecoin in particular about purpose-built, generally professional data center miners, right? That have costs. They invest serious money in infrastructure. There is a whole other ecosystem of DePIN, which is more retail-based, right? Whether you're talking about a Helium or you're talking about Hive Mapper or maybe others you can think of. And are those, retail historically doesn't have as good a grasp on their costs. There may be, right? And so how do you think about, is it just about meeting a minimum amount that matters, or a minimum amount that allows you to set it up, right? Like how does that lead to, if you're thinking about attracting professional infrastructure versus a retail world, those may be different, kind of drive different economic decisions.
Yeah, and I mean, that makes my life as a researcher hard because it is exactly that you don't know who's running these networks, right? I mean, all you can see on chain is like, oh, there's 3,000 storage provider on Filecoin, there's 15,000 nodes on Pocket. I mean, Pocket is maybe a bad example because there at least you can see, okay, it's actually just 150 operators, and then you can even see how many nodes each operator has. But this is often not even that is known. And even there, I mean, you can just like imply that, okay, obviously if you run a couple thousand nodes on Pocket, you probably are not the hobbyist that just, has one node or whatever. But yeah, this is the interesting piece, that you have the components of running nodes, which typically is just like, okay, cost for the hardware, cost for bandwidth, power, other OpEx. But then even when you tackle labor, for example, as an additional cost component, the data center guy, he probably has a full-time DevOps person or somebody checking the racks, exchanging slots, versus, the guys who just enjoy having up their antenna on the rooftop or putting it somewhere in the wild. I mean, they will not track an account. Oh, this was 5 hours to get there and set it up. I spent this many. They don't do this accounting. And I guess that's also the benefit of DePINs. On the other hand, that you would say, yeah, they like what they're doing. They just do it as a hobby and still support it and still are happy to earn something aside. Which I guess is general the very bullish case on those more retail focused DePINs. In ETH Denver, for example, I met various Uber drivers who had the HiveMapper camera, and they're just like, well, I make money with Uber, but this HiveMapper thing comes on top. And then some of them even had demo, right, for the car data. And this is, I guess, exactly how also the networks themselves can basically think about their remote emissions of like, okay, if they're anyway already doing it, I probably don't need to incentivize so much. It's then really more about, okay, HiveMapper, right? You need this device, and probably you want to attract them in a way that they know, okay, this will have amortization over this and this amount of time.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be much, but it has to be enough to sort of, let's just say, get them out of bed to do it, so to speak, right? Like, got to have enough to actually go to the mental effort of buying, installing, setting up, whatever it is. That's the sort of activation energy. Once it's up, it may take very little going forward, but you could even think of a system that had higher rewards just based on the first month or two or whatever it was, with a view that after that, the rewards could fall dramatically because it was sort of more effort to uninstall it, frankly, than to keep it going.
Yeah, and this is again coming back to the whole tokenomics. I mean, tokenomics itself is like a unfortunately very overloaded term, but the mechanism designed to basically also say, okay, you attract them, but how do you also make sure that these guys kind of like keep doing it, and kind of like don't just chase the there's HiveMapper, for example, there's Netix, like a competitor that doing similar things, and then they just do this. Like, how do you also attract a community and grow and sustain a community, right? This is the piece where I'm coming back to my initial fire analog to say, well, igniting it is one thing. You really also want to have a plan how you keep momentum and sustain it. And the extra hard challenge is like do that also throughout the bear market.
Yeah,
and when you have a plan for that, you're good.
Yeah, fair. That's all you got to do. But what I think about there is that the democratization of these networks is terrific, because what you're sort of talking about is built the right way. Early users earn tokens and participate in the growth of that network, which should be represented in the token price if that's designed appropriately, right? So it's as if you're an early seller on Amazon. All you get in Amazon is higher fees and higher prices over time as it grows, right? As a seller, you share in nothing. But here, as a provider, you earn tokens, which, if it works, should become more and more valuable over time. And so theoretically, you have an installed base who own tokens, you hope, who will have an incentive for your network to grow and become this community, and won't just hop to the next thing if they keep. But the point is, I guess what you're getting at, is there has to be a path for that growth and for token appreciation, which gets to the next point of how do you transition from this emission supply side incentives to actual paying customers. And I'm going to guess Filecoin is the farthest along in that journey, but I'm curious if you have others that have more paying customers that are starting to transition away from just the pure token emission kind of reward comment on the supply side.
Yeah, it's for sure the very, that leans in the third part of our research, because it's also very, very tricky to see how would you even measure like farthest along, because I mean, Filecoin for sure, there's, a good amount of revenue. But again, right, like you part of that is also incentivized with Filecoin Plus, and these types of things, and a very competitive pricing. Right. For me, the part here is to say, okay, for sure, the demand side is for me the biggest. We are the least mature here, because typically people think about, okay, stable supply first, it needs to be reliable, which makes sense, right? And then this is where rewards and things focus first. But not so much is actually happening on the demand side, even like, because if you consider DeFi again as a comparable, people get incentivized if you go to a perp to trade and things, because the networks know, yeah, every trade still pays a fee. I mean, we give them these guys back, but eventually it'll pay off, because the guys also enjoy doing it, using it, and have that. Now for DePINs, the use case is unfortunately not trading, where you can just like pull that one off. But this is stuff which I would like to see even more, right? To say, okay, because it's a different role. It's the whole, I mean, traditional businesses, they have whole sales department to basically say, use our product, right? This is what you get. And if you look through DePINs right now, again, it totally makes sense. They focus on stabilizing supply first. But the demand side typically is very much evangelized or driven by still like founder, like close to founder entities, right? If you could look at the broadcasting and live peer, for example, other deals like Demo selling the data. And it's also like, again, I would say it's right now mostly driven where we are at the process. But when I think about the mechanism design and like, okay, how can this work like over like a 5-10 year horizon? This is a step where I feel like a lot of them need to push more to also make sure that the network is thriving, by also making sure the supply side is still aligned. Right, for example, Akash is a good example where they just recently put aside kind of like a budget to actually drive and incentivize demand as well. And there were quite some discussions around that as well. Because I guess it's never easy to, again, adjust and distribute rewards and incentives, because at one point people might even be like, oh, this was our budget, right? Where you just say, it's not about yours or ours, right? At the end of the day, coming back, you want to create this community, this one piece to say, hey, if we get the supply, the demand up even further, obviously you as a supply provider, you also get more, right? It's not just like that we take away your rewards and you will
and your rewards should be worth more that you already have.
Exactly, right? Because you get token and demand drives the token value eventually.
If it's designed right. I mean, listen, I agree with that. And it's kind of funny because we're in the sector of technologists who like building tech. And that is the core strength of like everyone building all of these DePIN systems. Guess what isn't? BD and sales, right? And that is that. And so people optimize for what their strengths are. And so getting supply side, getting the tech working, getting all that stuff is the default, first order agenda, which it should be. But building up a sales department, building up all that's also hard. And that is, I've seen that, that obviously is an issue. It's also because, that also requires organizations, requires teams, requires incentives, all this stuff, which is, is sort of part and parcel of legacy companies which is protocol designers, we sort of wanted to not partake in. Like the whole concept here is let's build protocols that work and operate. And so we don't have to be burdened by the infrastructure of legacy companies, right? That's kind of the idea. And the whole thing of DePIN is we've got all this infrastructure, this network that works. And so you don't need to have a business because it's decentralized. But the problem is you got to the businesses are competing with you on the sales side. So you've got to go build these BD departments. And so I listen, and Fluence, that's something that we're sort of very cognizant of, is the need to have, team out there, talking to customers and bringing people on and explaining it, because it doesn't happen by itself, because people are competing with you, right? Like people don't just shift. And so recognize that. Do you see, though, in the projects you're looking at, is it as thought out? The durable monetization engine is just less mature in terms of adoption, but the actual economics are sustainable and viable. It just will take a little bit longer for that to scale. But the economics, are they as kind of focused on as the kind of supply reward side of the equation?
I mean, it's for sure top of mind, right? That people obviously know that they're building something to be used. So deep networks are like, okay, who are our customers? And at least the ones I talk to, they can at least tell, we talk to these guys and these guys. I think they even want that, even integrate with other solutions that make integration even easier, or adoption, so to speak. With regards to like how thought out that thing is typically not so much, because it's very much like a try and error type of area, right? Because it's I mean, you can look at storage or GPU, which I would argue has been around for the longest, and where you have like the biggest networks, and even there, you just look at the prices. I mean, I think Messari puts it out every now and then, right? To say, what's Filecoin storage compared to cloud? What's GPU compared to other things? And it's always way magnitudes even cheaper. But still, you're like, well, then actually, if you studied economics, efficient market forces, like everybody should use that supply, demand, price. Like, why not? And then you realize, well, it's probably because there are things about just usability, integration. Like if I'm a traditional business and I need compute AI, how do I integrate with Akash and all these other networks? There's some gaps I think we still need to close, and I feel like a lot of this is stuff that's on the good side that applies to basically all of them. So it's kind of like you can even think about a joint effort. Like, I mean, think about just fiat payments, right? That this burden of like, I'm not a crypto, like I have a business, I run AI models, I train them, I need GPU. Typically, I just have AWS or whatever, GCP to pay them in with my credit card. I can't do that typically when I go to crypto. So
that's the thing we're adding. Fluence make one. We're doing a credit card front end right away. That is something we think is important. I mean, ideally, the way I think about this is DePIN networks for the customers shouldn't even know it's using a DePIN network. It shouldn't even be like Fluent. We have a one pager. It doesn't mention crypto or blockchain at all, right? Like if these networks are efficient, that's how you could theoretically scale this, I would think. But you're right. You have to be in that mindset of the customer oriented mindset.
Exactly. And there's even chain solution, right? Solana, I think, has something built on top that like a third party that kind of like provides that, and you as a DePIN on Solana can just like then integrate with those and don't need to build it yourself. That was my point, right? It's just like not every protocol, at least when you're running on some shared blockchain, L1, L2, it needs to build it out themselves. There should be solutions that kind of like provide that for everybody, because they have the same problem. But then there's probably still like very specific needs. I mean, for example, storage, when you think about enterprise solutions, there's all these like as a business, regulations about data protection, privacy, if you run in Europe versus US. It's just very complicated to then say like, yeah, I do that now on this like decentralized network where I don't even know who's running this thing, God knows where. And oh yeah, that's funky math that guarantees me that's correct. I tell that my regulator that there's math that makes sure that it is right. This is still some challenges that I think is the causing these gaps of it's not just, it can't be just the price. Let's put it this way, right? If it would be just the price, we would have way more traction.
And I mean, that effectively says it's not, these services are not as commoditized as it may sound. So whether it's computer storage, it sounds like, oh, price per terabyte, price per, core month, whatever. Like, it's not that simple. There's actually a much more complexity in delivering that service than that commoditized, than that price would let you believe. And that's what I think we're discovering, right?
Yeah, exactly. And maybe also as a side component, like little detail here, when you talk about you pay for service, I mean, yes, it shows you like, okay, you need to pay like 5 tokens whatsoever, but there's transaction fees on the chain as well, right? Like, and then it also is a little bit of like these cloud providers. I mean, why are they successful? It's just like they attract you with like free usage, you get AWS credits whatsoever. And then at one point, as you scale, they just say, we have everything. We have the machine learning models. We have this, we have pipelines. You never need to leave the system. And actually, if you want to leave the system, the getting the data off is going to cost you super much. And then the people are just like, okay, then, they're locked in, right? And in DePIN, in these solutions, we might have means to attract them, even if we solve, for this on-ramp and commoditize and have things under the hood. Still, we're far away from like similar dynamics where people are just like, okay, once I'm in, I basically have everything I need, and it's click of a button, similar to how you would scale up down on AWS.
Yeah, I mean, and that's but you're talking there about very cloud-based stuff, storage, compute, et cetera. That's different than like the Helium, Hive Mapper, Glow is doing solar, right? The network, the DePIN ecosystem. There's even DePIN, DePIN Uber, for example. Like the range of infrastructure being used expands beyond the cloud stuff, which is what you and I are most knowledgeable on, I guess. But there may be a chance that the big adoption comes from one of those other, uses versus the cloud replacements, at least at some point.
Yeah. I mean, you're right? Like, this is the part where I see these. I mean, right, physical resource networks, right? Those where you need to spit up a sensor or an antenna or something like that. These guys for sure. I mean, here in mobile seems, for example, to have good traction because people realize, it's easy to use, right? Because they, yes, right, cooperated with T-Mobile, I guess, and then it's just like you don't need to worry about like, am I connected to some Helium node or do I use the other one? I just have signal, I have data, and I pay my $5 or $20, what it is like comparably cheap. So this is the piece where you say like, yeah, it can work on the demand side. It's just still something where I would say, what I want to say is like, the cool thing about these networks is they might even have a nice connection between supply and demand, because the supply guys, if I run an antenna, obviously I tell my friends, I'm like, yeah, I have this antenna, it earns me this and this amount, and here I have the phone. So basically I'm not paying because I earn something, I spend something on the network, it's nice. And then the other guys are like, okay, what do I need to do to have the same? And they just say like, well, just to, spend these dollars on 5G antennas might not be the best example because they're expensive, but IoT, right, like there are networks that probably give you the same story on a cheaper way. But this evangelism flywheel probably works nice for these.
It's super relevant when you can have retail crowdsourced infrastructure. They're also your potential users, and if you can have those can overlap, that's great. But Robert, let's back up for a second because we've dug into this in a lot of detail. But can you talk first, introduce people to 1KX, which is one of the leading venture seed firms in the space, and then a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so 1KX been around since 2018. Two former entrepreneurs that founded it, Chris and Lasse, cool guys. And early stage, typically type of investments that we do. I'm personally not so much involved in like making the investments decision. Luckily, I'm more one part of the team, back office type of person, right? Where you say, okay, once we invested in protocols, we help you. For example, in my case, with token design, setting up the incentives, thinking about all things, token launch or incentive mechanisms. But then there's also other in the team, obviously legal, or you need to hire people, or you need to list your token on exchanges, like all these stuff. Like when you run your protocol, when you build your sort of startup, obviously, typically you're a small team because this is where we invest. And how can we help you to, grow fast, and not no need to hire, like for each of these things you need like hire a different person, because then you're probably running out of your funds quite quickly.
Yeah, I mean the way 1KX seeded Fluence, so I've and I've known Lasse in particular for quite a while. But I guess the benefit of having a established large firm is exactly the resources of somebody like you who are specialized in a particular area and are a resource for portfolio companies, as are other members of the team in the different verticals you mentioned. But what about you? Where were you before 1KX? How did you get into the whole space? Like what was your journey to where you are right now?
Yeah. Well, it was a long journey. So way back in the days, I studied math and finance, and then also, did back then what probably a lot of people did, like, coded up an app and try to build up a startup in Berlin. After that, didn't turn out to be like a huge success story. I just went to a different way where you go when you study math and finance, which is banking, traditional consulting, these types of routes. And then from there went over to, also more like the zeitgeist, e-commerce, data science, making up all these nice algorithms, and to scale up these businesses. And I think 2018 was the last station before 1KX where I was actually leading the LLM department back then, right? I mean, it was obviously just the transition from these traditional Word2Vec models to the more current
you're a small
models.
You're a small universe of people that knew what LLM was back then. I mean, that is, you were early.
Yeah. I still remember when we went through like Ernie and Bird and all these like different Sesame Street Google papers, and you're just like, what am I doing here? But then, 2022, officially, I joined 1KX. I every now and then also would look into, because with data science, you're used to do all these like agent-based modeling simulations, plus with a finance background, right? In DeFi Summer. DeFi Summer was what hooked me up personally with the crypto space. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. You can do stuff, and it's super, super interesting. And that dragged me into the space. And then officially 2022, I joined 1KX, and ever since basically do that with portfolio companies and my research, right, to kind of like apply, help simulations, help mechanism design, help economics, help dive into the DeFi space, these type of things.
And if given, I guess, your focus on both tokenomics, working with founders, any experiences you call on in particular on your background that were super helpful, whether it's regarding crypto or this particular space? I mean, anything from either your education or your previous positions that you are really thankful that you had or have proven to be useful and helpful?
I mean, there's several ones. I guess the latest station, right, the LLM data science, that turned out to be a coincidence. And it's like, okay, I mean, back then you saw how useful it was in practice, and you dug into the first principle foundational mechanisms. I have not have seen like that how quickly this now with ChatGPT became a thing, and now even enters crypto full steam ahead. And it obviously helps then when you talk to modulus, for example, right? I mean, the combining DK proofs with LMMs and machine learning models, it obviously helps a lot when you went through that learning years ago to understand the different models and what's easier or harder to circuitize, and then how impactful it is when okay, they make a circuit for like a 1.5 billion LMM parameter LMM. That's for sure, I would say, very helpful right now. But obviously, overall, studying math, being able to calculate and solving equations always helps.
And what about the incentives? Because a whole bunch of your, focus now is thinking about rewards and incentives. Does that come from math, or do you think about that from previous experiences, startups, or where does that kind of behavioral, I guess, piece come from?
Yeah. You're right. I mean, I one time before doing the LMM stuff, I did pricing. And this is, of course, very, very much dig into also like all sorts of like you understanding your users. And this is a cool thing about the e-commerce space, right? You have this super transparent view on, but how are your users reacting more like mechanically, elasticities, like these types of content. You understand the data, you understand the marketing side as well, like, okay, how's retention working? How the different marketing channels work, customer acquisitions, like all these things that each and every protocol also need to figure out, because at the end of the day, a lot of incentives, talking about demand side as well, is customer acquisition. And I mean, we're for sure not as advanced at these e-commerce where two players are in terms of like knowing exactly, oh, I put this advertisement on TV back then, and this is how much this incoming revenue can be attributed. But I guess we're getting there eventually. So yeah, just knowing this helped a lot to also just understanding the mechanisms beyond pure math, beyond pure like, okay, I do this and then this, because the whole behavioral economics spectrum, for example, knowing that people have all these different kind of like irrational behaviors that you could kind of like address with certain ways you design your incentives, and also you communicate your incentive. I guess that's also something not to be forgotten, right? Like that a lot of also is like how, when, and how you roll out these your incentive programs.
Yeah, and how you articulate that obviously makes is a it's a really interesting point. And what about things? Normally ask this of people more on the entrepreneur side, but for you, I ask it slightly differently. What mistakes have you seen projects make? Right, we see successes; those are 100 reasons and things to look at on success side. The mistakes are usually harder to see or fade away pretty fast. So, anything you see, whether it's entrepreneurs or projects, in terms of mistakes made that you'd caution or call out to warn people about.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously you can do more mistakes. You can get things either wrong than right, I would say. Maybe one common pattern that applies basically to everybody is really the kind of like every now and then kind of like reprioritize or like revisit like where you focus on or where you're actually marching towards, and doing this being aware of where you typically focus on, because I mean, we all love to do what we're good at. So coming back to what you mentioned earlier, typically founders are tech oriented, very much like, oh, I can improve that, make them more efficient, make that even better. And then all other engineers will look at it and say like, wow, this is like insanely good. Whereas you're like, well, this is good if you're, CTO of a company and then or engineering focus. But if you're CEO and if you need to build a business, obviously there's other departments that you need to take care of as well. And just being aware that there are blind spots, right? I'm the same in mass finance. I always have this lens on. So whenever there are topics coming up where I just like, well, I don't know that, I can give you my opinion, but probably you should ask somebody who has at least a different lens, or like a lens that fits that question, and be like constantly making yourself aware that, this is where you lack attention. And, tokenomics is for sure something like that. Like many of these earlier stage, well, basically none of those earlier stage protocols have like a guy who's like, yeah, I'm the guy who, I'm fully focused on token stuff. I'll build that myself, right? Because frankly, why would you need them in the founding team, right? They're important later on. But just being aware that, okay, at one point you need to get those guys in, and you need to get those guys in not two weeks before you want to launch a token.
Yep.
Right? Because there's lots of things to think about to get it right. This was a very token focused answer, but it applies to others as well, like speedy, sales, marketing. Just know your blind spots. I mean, I guess it's really good for any type of founder and entrepreneur in general.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about that is, if you have multiple founders, ideally they each have different areas of expertise that helps reduce your blind spots. If you've got 3 serious tech founders, that's not as helpful. But I certainly grasp that. Any DePIN projects in particular you're excited about now, or any problems that aren't solved you see being solved? Anything, whether it's a project by name or a subsector, that you're excited about?
I mean, the one problem where I'm getting more and more excited is the whole notion about, verification. Because we talked about, well, somebody needs to provide compute, storage, set up a sensor or solar panel or whatever. But how? And then, they get rewarded when it's used. But a lot of this is also just like, it needs to be there. It needs to be available. Capacity needs to be there. Because when it's used, obviously, you can easily track that, it was there and it's been used. But, for compute, for example, you want to provide customers like, yeah, you can spin up this super extensive algorithm here because we have the compute available, but then there's not. Like, how can you ensure that service providers, how I would call them, like service nodes, that just say, yeah, I have something, I have a sensor spun up, the solar panel is there, the compute is there. How can I kind of like verify that is there? Or it has been delivered properly? Think about the more complex tasks like rendering, transcoding, where, in order to check that it has been done properly, you need to redo it. And that obviously doesn't make sense. It's economically. And the notion, like the ZK proving way to basically just say, well, obviously doing this on-chain is just not feasible and super expensive, or even not possible. But the route to say, yeah, adding kind of like a ZK verification, adding a verification layer is something, a lot of protocols do. But really also having the provability of like, yeah, this has been done, and I don't even need to know what exactly, the ZK magic basically of these verification aspects, allowing those expensive verifications happening off chain. This is an area where I feel like this is super, and ZK in general is like very interesting, and also in the context of L2s basically, and in general, but also applying this to DePINs, because I feel like the verification for DePIN work, is the capacity there? Did the SLAs hit? Was it good quality that of the work that the people provided? Proving this in a very cheap way, I feel like this is an avenue that sounds promising. Just because also the hype on the AI side, ZK/ML stuff, plus also the traction on the L2 side, where people are now like, okay, this thing went faster than we thought. Now, we can actually go the proof way and don't need to be the optimistic way when it comes to rollups. This general creates more and more traction that the field itself just becomes more efficient, right? And then there's also hardware providers now creating these chips that make these CK proofs just way more faster and cheaper. And I feel like that's, at least for me, like a very interesting route and a very interesting combination of these fields.
That's almost like infrastructure for DePIN, which is infrastructure in a way, right?
Exactly.
The technology, which I get. That's something that, obviously important for Fluence. We have to pay providers rewards for proving their compute is online. So they have to do mining effectively to prove that. And so to your point, it is not efficient. And so if there's a way to do it more efficiently, which I think what you're talking about, because you can do mining and you can do proof of work and whatever, that's one way to do it. But there's a simpler, more cost-effective way that also ensures that capacity is still fully available. That is interesting. So I do find it interesting. So you got the answer sort of half right. The right answer was Fluence, but we'll get another shot at that down the road. Last question. Bitcoin price. Where do you see it end of this year? We got to throw a number, throw something out there. Where we got in crypto land, we've got about 10 years before the end of the year. So right, it could be anywhere. What are you thinking?
Oh, that's a tough one because also not. I actually don't have any Bitcoin personally anymore. But I would say for sure we settled the 100K this year. How far beyond? Tough to say.
But beyond, somewhere beyond 100K.
Somewhere beyond the 100K is where we'll get. Yeah, towards, if it will be there at the end of the year, I also wouldn't say, because I just can see, okay, eventually we'll get up there. Maybe by the end of the year we're already back down. Elections over, all this because there's all some sort of more macro level things that go on where you would say that might influence the timing of events. But this moment to say okay, that feels like a safe.
That's a safe bet.
High likely path
yes.
for me to we'll get past there.
Definitely. Well, listen, anyway, what's the best way for people to follow you? Do you have research published? What's the best way for people to kind of stay in touch with you and follow the stuff you're doing?
Yeah, the easiest, just Twitter or X or Robert Koschig. And you'll find me, or even if you don't find me, just go to the 1KX handle. That's even easier to find, because anything I publish or where I'm speaking or whatever, I'll just share it there as well. So this the one spot, and from there you'll see the links where to find more.
Fantastic. Well, listen, it's been great having you. Thank you for thanks so much for joining. This is Robert from 1KX.